The wagon wheel snapped clean in two just as the last light bled out of the Montana sky, and Clara Whitfield realized, with a calm that surprised even her, that she was going to die alone on this mountain if she did not find shelter before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. She'd been traveling the Bitterroot Valley Road for 3 days, ever since leaving the small supply town of Garrison behind her. The wagon was loaded with what remained of her life: a cedar chest, 2 quilts her mother had sewn, a cast-iron skillet, a small crate of canned goods, and a leather-bound Bible with her name pressed in gold along the spine. She was 22 years old, recently widowed by a husband she had never truly loved, and she was headed north toward her aunt's homestead near the settlement of Deer Lodge. That plan was now lying broken in the dirt alongside her right rear wheel. Clara climbed down from the wagon seat and stood in the gathering dark, her wool coat pulled tight across her chest, her dark brown hair whipping around her face in the mountain wind. The horse, a steady roan mare named Pepper, stamped nervously and tossed her head. The temperature in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana Territory could fall with terrifying speed once the sun went behind the peaks, and the sun had gone behind those peaks a full hour ago. It was September of 1874, and this stretch of wilderness between Garrison and Deer Lodge was not a place where a woman alone survived mistakes. She had a rifle, she had a lantern and matches. She had enough sense to know that neither of those things would save her from exposure if she stayed with the wagon overnight. The nearest homestead, as best she could calculate from the rough map the storekeeper in Garrison had drawn for her on the back of a receipt, was somewhere off the main track, up a side trail that climbed into the timber. She had passed the turning 2 miles back, she thought, though she could not be certain. Clara tied Pepper to the wagon wheel that remained intact, patted the mare's warm neck, and made a decision. She would take the lantern and the rifle and walk back to find that side trail. If she was wrong, if there was no homestead, she would build a fire and wait for morning. She was not a woman who gave herself over to panic. That was one thing her difficult marriage had given her, a spine made of iron. She had walked perhaps a mile in the dark when the sound reached her. It was not an animal sound, not the crack of timber or the rustle of brush. It was an axe striking wood, slow and steady and deliberate, the rhythm of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was in no particular hurry. She raised the lantern and turned toward the sound and saw, through the black columns of the pine trees, a faint orange glow. She moved toward it, her boots crunching softly on the carpet of fallen needles, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The trees thinned, and she stepped into a wide clearing, and there he was. He was splitting wood in the near dark by the light of a fire burning in a stone ring near the door of a large log cabin. He was enormous. There was no other word that captured it. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they looked carved from the same timber he was splitting, and arms that belonged on a draft horse rather than a man. His dark brown hair fell to his collar, slightly wavy and wild in the mountain wind, and a short dark beard covered a jaw that looked like it had been shaped from granite. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, and his forearms were corded with muscle that bunched and shifted with every swing of the axe. He moved with the unhurried ease of a man who had split 1,000 cords of wood before this night and expected to split 1,000 more. He sensed her before she spoke. The axe paused at its apex, and he turned, slowly, without alarm, and looked at her across the firelight. His eyes were very dark, nearly black in the low light, and they moved from her face to her lantern to her rifle and back to her face with steady, measuring calm. "My wagon wheel broke," Clara said, "about a mile back down the main track. I need shelter for the night." He set the axe head down against the chopping block and rested both massive hands on the handle, studying her in the firelight. "You alone?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment longer, and then he nodded, once, the way a man nods when something is settled. "Come inside. I will put your horse in the barn." His name was Eli Carne, and he had lived on this mountain for 4 years. She learned that much from him that first night, sitting at his heavy pine table while he built up the fire in the stone hearth and put a pot of venison stew on the iron hook over the flames. He was not a talkative man. He moved around the cabin with the economy of someone who had long since sorted the world into what was necessary and what was not, and conversation, it seemed, was mostly in the second category. But he answered what she asked, plainly and without evasion, and he never once made her feel unsafe, which was its own kind of miracle considering she was a lone woman in a stranger's cabin in the mountains. He had come up from Colorado originally, he told her, working first as a trapper and then as a logger, and eventually just building himself a place and staying. He knew the mountains the way most men knew the layout of their own parlors, every trail, every spring, every place where elk bedded down in the snow. He trapped in winter and sold the pelts to traders who came through Deer Lodge in the spring. He had a kitchen garden and a root cellar and enough dried and canned provisions to outlast most winters. He did not explain why he had chosen to live alone, and she did not ask because some things were visible without being spoken. He gave her his bed, a rope frame affair with a thick mattress stuffed with pine needles and dried grass and covered with 2 heavy buffalo robes, and he slept by the fire in a bedroll. And in the morning he rose before light and started coffee on the iron stove, and was halfway through a plate of salt pork and cornbread by the time she appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, her hair loose and her eyes still soft with sleep. He looked up at her and then looked back at his plate. "Coffee is hot." She sat across the table from him and poured herself a cup from the battered tin pot and said, "I need to get my wagon fixed. I have to reach Deer Lodge." "I know someone in Deer Lodge who builds wheels," he said. "I will ride in and bring him back. 2 days, maybe 3. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You would do that? You cannot leave your wagon on the road. Someone will strip it." It was not a generous answer, not in the soft sense that most people meant generosity. It was simply the practical acknowledgement that a problem existed and he was capable of solving it. She was beginning to understand that this was how Eli Carne expressed almost everything. He left at first light on the gray mountain horse he called Smoke, and Clara was alone in his cabin with nothing but the fire and the wind in the pine tops and her own thoughts for company. She was surprised to find that she was not frightened and not particularly lonely. The cabin was solid and warm and somehow deeply, profoundly peaceful. She built up the fire, washed the breakfast dishes in the bucket of water he had drawn from the spring before he left, and spent the day exploring the small world he had made. The cabin was a single large room with the bedroom at one end, separated by a hanging wool blanket. The main room held the stone hearth, the pine table with 4 chairs, a set of open shelves holding provisions and tools, and a corner where he kept his trapping equipment, steel traps, stretching frames, bundles of wire. A rifle and a shotgun hung above the door on pegged antlers. The shelves held, along with the tins and dried beans and sacks of cornmeal, 3 books, a farmer's almanac from 1871, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, and a King James Bible even more battered than her own. She cooked supper from his provisions that evening, a pot of beans with salt pork and cornbread from the skillet, the same way her mother had made it, and ate it alone at his table with his Bible open beside her plate, not reading it exactly, just turning the pages slowly and thinking about how strange and improbable it was that a broken wheel had deposited her in this place, in this man's careful, quiet life. He came back on the 3rd day with the wheelwright, a stout German man named Hans Fischer from Deer Lodge, and the 3 of them went down the main track together, Fischer riding his own mule loaded with tools and spare timber. The wheel was repaired by mid-afternoon, and Fischer charged her $2, which she paid from the small purse she kept pinned inside her coat. She stood by the repaired wagon with Pepper hitched and ready, and Eli stood a few feet away with his arms crossed over his massive chest, watching Fischer collect his tools. The wind had come up out of the northwest again, carrying the first real cold of the coming autumn, and the light had that brilliant, hard quality it got in Montana in September, everything sharp and edged and bright. She should go. The road to Deer Lodge was clear, and her wagon was sound, and her aunt was waiting. There was absolutely no reason to stay. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for the bed and the food and riding to Deer Lodge." He looked at her, and something moved behind his eyes, something careful and restrained, like a man holding a door almost shut against a wind. "Safe road to you." She climbed up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins and clicked her tongue at Pepper. She drove 40 yards down the track and pulled the mare to a stop. She sat there for a long moment with her back to the cabin, the reins loose in her hands, feeling the wind on her face. Then she turned the wagon around. She drove back to the clearing and climbed down and walked to where he was still standing, because he had not moved, not 1 inch, and she thought later that this was somehow the most important thing, that he had not moved. My aunt's homestead is 20 acres and a small house, and she is 63 years old, Clara said. She does not need much help. I was going there because I had nowhere else to go, and I'm going to tell you something that is not ladylike to say, but I have found that the truth is considerably more useful than being ladylike. He waited, those dark eyes steady on her face. I would rather be here, she said, if you would have me. The silence that followed was long enough that she began to feel the heat of embarrassment climbing her neck, and then he said very quietly, I will have you. She moved into the cabin that evening, bringing the cedar chest and the quilts and the cast-iron skillet and the Bible, and he rearranged his shelves to make room for her things without being asked. He gave her the bedroom, and she told him firmly that she would not take his bed from him permanently, and after a short, dignified argument, they agreed to share it, which led to another kind of conversation entirely, conducted in the close dark of the mountain night, with the fire burning low in the outer room and the wind singing through the timber, and when the morning came gray and cold and luminous, they were no longer strangers. The first weeks were a kind of discovery that Clara had not known she was capable of. She had been married at 19 to Thomas Whitfield, a schoolteacher from Cincinnati who had come west with grand ideas about settling land and building a future, and who had turned out to be a man who was much better at talking about doing things than actually doing them. He had died of a fever 16 months after their wedding, and she had grieved him the way you grieve something you never quite had, with a dull, hollow ache rather than the sharp-edged pain of real loss. She had sold the small cabin he had half built and used the money to buy the wagon and the provisions and head north toward her aunt, and she had told herself that was enough, that she was fine, that she would be fine. Eli was nothing like Thomas. Where Thomas had been full of words and plans and enthusiasm, Eli was full of silence and action and the kind of steadiness that felt after a while like standing on solid rock after years of walking on ice. He did not make promises, he simply did things. He had a way of looking at her when she spoke that made her feel like everything she said was worth listening to, not because he responded with great enthusiasm, but because he was genuinely, completely paying attention. He taught her things. How to read the weather off the mountain peaks to the north, the way the clouds stacked and thinned. How to set a rabbit snare in the brush along the creek. How to bank a fire so it would hold through the night without burning out or flaring up. She taught him things in return. She was a better cook than he was by a considerable margin, and she had a gift for making the small space of the cabin feel warmer and more alive, rearranging things slightly, adding a small bunch of dried wildflowers to the table, hanging one of her mother's quilts on the wall beside the bedroom door where the color of it caught the firelight in the evenings. The first time he laughed, really laughed, not just the brief half-smile she had come to treasure, was the third week when she accidentally dumped an entire pot of bean soup on herself while trying to lift it from the fire hook, and stood there dripping in the middle of the cabin saying, with perfect composure, "Well, that is a waste of good beans." He stood in the doorway from outside and laughed so hard he had to brace himself against the door frame, and the sound of it filled the cabin like something that had been needed there for a long time. By October, the snows had begun in earnest, and the world outside the cabin shrank to the clearing, the barn, the woodpile, and the trail down to the frozen creek. They spent the long evenings at the table, she reading aloud from Robinson Crusoe, while he worked on harness leather or sharpened trap springs, the fire roaring, the snow building up outside, pepper and smoke quiet in the barn. The intimacy of it was extraordinary to her, not the physical closeness, though that was extraordinary too, but the domestic closeness, the way their days had woven together so naturally and completely that she could not imagine the shape of his days without her or hers without him. He had not said he loved her. She noticed this the way you notice a stone in your boot, not always, not constantly, but persistently, at certain moments, usually the ones when she felt it herself most clearly, and looked at him and found him already looking at her with that careful, almost pained expression that she had decided meant something powerful was happening behind those dark eyes, something he did not quite know how to let out. The moment came in November, on a night when the temperature had dropped to something brutal and the wind was coming off the northern peaks like the world was ending. They were in bed under the buffalo robes, close together for warmth, and she had been quiet for a long time when she heard him, in the complete dark, say her name. Just her name, Clara, in a voice that was different from his usual voice, lower, rougher, stripped of all his usual careful restraint. "Yes," she said. "I want you to know," he said, and stopped, started again. "You are the best thing that has come to this mountain, the best thing that has come to me." She turned toward him under the heavy robes and found his face with her hands in the dark, and she felt the way his jaw tightened under her palms. "Eli," she said, I know exactly." "I love you," he said, and it sounded like something he had been carrying a long time finally set down. She pressed her forehead against his chin and felt the warmth of his breath on her hair. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while now." "I know," he said, with a slight roughness that she realized after a moment was his version of laughing. The winter deepened into December and January, brutal and magnificent. The snow in the clearing stood 4 feet deep, and the drifts against the cabin walls reached the window sills. Eli checked his trap lines every 2 days, no matter the weather, and Clara learned to read the sky well enough to know when to worry about him and when not to. He always came back before dark, heavily loaded with pelts and dusted with snow, and she always had hot food waiting and the fire stacked high, and the moment he stepped through the door became, without her ever quite deciding it would, her favorite moment of each day. She told him in January, a cold, bright morning when the sky was the color of a blue jay's wing and the snow dazzled in the early sun. She had been keeping count and keeping certain, and she was certain now. She came to the barn door where he was forking hay to the horses, and she said in her usual direct way, "I believe I'm going to have a child." He stopped forking. He turned around. She had thought she knew by this point all of his expressions, the full range of what his face could do. She had seen him tired and focused and amused and quietly tender. She had not seen this. He stared at her for a long moment with something moving through his face that she did not have a word for, something vast and stunned and fiercely, almost terrifyingly glad. He crossed the barn in 3 steps and cupped her face in both his enormous hands and looked at her as though he was seeing her for the very first time, and then he pressed his forehead against hers and let out a long, slow breath. "You're going to have a child," he said, more to himself than to her. "Our child," she said. He pulled back and looked at her face again, and something settled in his expression that was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. His eyes were bright with it, whatever it was, joy that went so deep it was almost solemn. He smiled at her then, fully and openly, the rare smile that she had spent months learning to earn, and it remade his whole face, softened the strong jaw and the hard cheekbones and the careful eyes into something openly, vulnerably happy. He pulled her against his chest, her face against the solid warmth of his flannel shirt, his arms wrapped around her so completely that the January cold simply ceased to exist. She felt him press a kiss against the top of her head. "You're going to have my son," he murmured into her hair. She laughed against his chest. "You do not know it will be a son." "I know," he said, and his voice had a certainty in it that was not stubbornness, but something closer to faith. "A son. Like his mother. The bravest person on this mountain." She pulled back and looked up at him, this enormous, gentle, formidable man, and she had genuinely never seen anything like the pride on his face in that moment. It was not the ordinary pride of a man who had done something well. It was the pride of a man who felt the whole world had just revealed its deepest and most astonishing purpose, and that he was standing at the exact center of it. It filled the barn, that pride, the way music fills a room, the way first light fills the valley. She had never seen a man so proud. "Eli," she said softly. "We are going to need more wood," he said, and she started laughing again, because that was Eli. That was exactly Eli, brought to the edge of something infinite and then stepping back and picking up a practical task. and she loved him so completely in that moment that she thought her chest might split open with it. He was different after that, and the same. He was still quiet and competent and steady, still checked his trap lines and split the wood and kept the horses fed and the cabin warm. But there was something different in the way he moved around her now, a heightened attentiveness, a care that expressed itself in small, continuous acts, making sure the fire never went low, bringing snow in and melting it so she had warm water for washing without having to go outside in the cold, positioning himself between her and the wind whenever they crossed the yard together without seeming to do it consciously. He would not let her lift the heavy water bucket. She argued with him about this for 3 days before conceding, because there was no winning an argument with Eli about anything that touched her safety. She had learned this. He listened carefully to every point she made, acknowledged each one with a nod, and then did exactly what he had intended to do from the start. February brought a spell of weather so severe that even Eli stayed inside for 4 days, the wind screaming off the mountains and the snow coming down so dense and continuous that the trees across the clearing disappeared entirely. They sat by the fire those days and talked more than they had talked in all the previous months combined, about their childhoods, the people they had been before the mountains, the way life had twisted and turned to bring them both to this particular clearing in Montana territory. He was from Missouri originally, as it turned out, not Colorado as she had initially understood. He had grown up on a farm in the Ozarks, the oldest of 4 brothers, and had come west at 19 following the pull of something he described as the need to see what was on the other side of everything. He had spent years moving through Colorado and Wyoming and Idaho before Montana had caught him the way it catches certain people, absolutely and permanently, like a hook rather than a magnet. She told him about Cincinnati and the small house where she had grown up, her mother a seamstress and her father a clerk, the kind of quietly dignified poverty that produced practical children. She told him about Thomas, simply and honestly, not dramatizing what had not been dramatic. He listened without asking questions, and when she finished he said, he did not know how fortunate he was. And she said, he was a good man, just not a well man, and not quite a strong man. And Eli said nothing more about Thomas, which was exactly right. She told him about the journey west, the decision made alone in the small cabin after the funeral, the wagon and Pepper, and the 3 days on the road before the wheel broke. I was not afraid, she said, and then considered it more honestly. I was afraid, but I did not know it. I was so focused on what to do next that I did not have room to be afraid. That is what courage is, Eli said from his chair by the fire. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to stop. She looked at him over the fire. Where did you hear that? He looked slightly abashed, which was extraordinary on that face. I thought of it myself. Eli Carne, she said, you are a great deal more interesting than you let on. He did not look abashed at all now. He looked at her with those dark eyes and said very quietly, you make me interesting. By March, the worst of the winter had broken enough that the trail to Deer Lodge was passable again, and Eli made the trip to sell his winter's worth of pelts to the trading post there. He was gone 2 days, the first time they had been apart since October, and Clara found the cabin very quiet without him in a way she had not anticipated. She stayed busy. There was always work, and she had her regular tasks well established by now. But she was aware of his absence as a kind of steady, mild ache, the way you are aware of a tooth only after it is gone, except in reverse. He came back late on the second afternoon with the pack horse loaded, his saddlebags heavy. He came through the door and stopped and looked at her for a moment before he crossed the room in 3 steps and kissed her with a thoroughness that she was still slightly breathless from a full minute later. He had brought things from the trading post, a length of soft cotton calico for making baby clothes, a small tin of good tea, a bag of sugar, and a book, a novel, Jane Eyre, the first new book either of them had had since autumn. He had folded all of this out onto the table with the same no-ceremony efficiency with which he did everything. And she stood looking at it and feeling something so large and warm move through her chest that she had to blink several times. The calico, she said. You thought of the calico. You will need to start sewing, he said, as though it were obvious, as though he had not gone through a trading post carefully thinking about what she would need. This man who had lived alone for 4 years with no needs beyond his own. "Eli," she said. He was already putting the sugar away on the shelf. The man at the trading post said, "Dr. Hammond rides out from Deer Lodge for confinements. I have his address written down." She came to him and put both hands flat against his back, between his shoulder blades, feeling the warmth of him and the solid impossibility of him. He stopped what he was doing. "When the time comes," she said, "I want you there." He turned. "I will be there. You cannot leave the room. Men always leave." "I will be there," he said again, with a quietness that was absolute. Spring came to the Bitterroot Mountains with extravagant force, the way it always comes to places that have been held under winter for a long time. All at once, overwhelmingly, everything alive and insistent and brilliant. The snow went off the clearing in a week in mid-April, and the creek roared with snowmelt, and the first wildflowers pushed up through the wet, dark earth along the barn wall, tiny yellow things, tough and determined. Clara's pregnancy was advancing in the way her body had settled into it comfortably and solidly, and she moved around the cabin and the clearing with her usual competence, slightly slower but no less certain. She had started on the baby things, working through the evenings by firelight on small shirts and a nightgown from the calico Eli had brought, and he would sit across the table from her watching her hands work with an expression she had learned to identify as the deep, contented variety of the pride that had been in his face since January. He watched her with that expression a great deal. One evening in April, she looked up from her sewing and caught him watching her and said, "You are looking at me again." "I look at you all the time," he said, unashamed. "You look at me like I have performed some extraordinary feat," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You have," he said. "I have not done anything yet. Ask me how extraordinary I am in July." He almost smiled. "I do not mean the child," he said. "I mean you. What you are." She set down the tiny shirt and looked at him across the table. "What am I?" "Everything that was missing," he said simply. She felt the warmth of it move from her chest out to the ends of her fingers. She picked up the shirt again, because if she did not do something with her hands, she was going to cry. And she was not, she had decided some time ago, going to cry at every single beautiful thing he said, because he would start saying beautiful things more carefully if it made her weep every time. In May, a problem arrived at the mountain, which was not entirely unexpected in Montana Territory in 1874, in the form of 2 men on horseback who rode into the clearing late on a Wednesday afternoon when Eli was checking the upper trap line. Clara was in the yard, throwing feed to the 3 chickens they kept, and she heard the horses before she saw them. She straightened and turned and watched them come out of the tree line with the calm alertness she had developed over the winter, the kind of alertness that did not show itself on the outside, but was gathered and ready on the inside. The men were rough-looking, trail-dirty, with the hollow-eyed wariness of men who had been moving for a while and were looking for an opportunity. One of them was heavy-set with a red beard, and the other was thin and younger. They stopped their horses at the edge of the clearing, and the heavy-set one looked at her, then at the cabin, then at her again. "Man of the house around?" he said. "He will be shortly," Clara said. Her voice was level and pleasant, and her hand was, without any drama, resting on the handle of the hatchet she had been using to split kindling before she started feeding the chickens. "We are looking for work," the thin young one said. He sounded like he might actually mean it, but the heavy-set one's eyes were still moving over the cabin and the barn with that assessing, calculating quality that she did not like. "There is a settlement 20 miles south," Clara said. "More likely to find work there." The heavy-set man looked back at her and let his gaze settle on the obvious roundness of her belly in a way that made her grip tighten slightly on the hatchet handle. "That's a long ride for a dry camp," he said. "We were hoping for some hospitality." "I'm afraid we cannot offer much," Clara said, and her voice was as pleasant as ever. The sound of hoofbeats in the trees behind the 2 men was not subtle. Eli was not trying for subtle. He came out of the timber on Smoke at a walk, his rifle laid across the front of the saddle, casual and deliberate, and he was so large on horseback that the thin young man actually flinched slightly at the sight of him. Eli looked at the 2 men with the same steady, measuring look with which he had first looked at Clara across the firelight 8 months ago, except without any of the warmth that had followed it. He stopped Smoke 15 feet from the strangers and sat there, those dark eyes moving from one man to the other, saying nothing, letting his size and the rifle and the quality of his stillness do all the necessary communicating. The heavy-set man with the red beard cleared his throat. "Just passing through," he said. "Pass through, then," Eli said. They went. They went quickly and without another word, and did not look back, and Eli watched them ride back into the tree line and tracked the sound of their horses until it faded before he dismounted and led Smoke to the barn. Clara met him at the barn door. "I had the hatchet," she said. "I know," he said. "You were fine." He looked at her for a moment with something that was very controlled and very fierce at the same time. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly," she said. He looked at the tree line where the men had gone and then back at her and said, "I'm going to cut the lower trail, make it harder to find." He was already leading Smoke into the barn, mind moving to the practical, the way it always did. She followed him in. "Eli." He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back when you did." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and something shifted in them, something very deep and very certain. "I will always come back," he said. "You understand that." She understood it. She understood it all the way down to the center of herself. June came warm and long, the mountain days stretching out in a glory of long light and green meadow grass and the sound of the creek running full and clear below the timber. Clara worked the kitchen garden with the dedication of someone making a home rather than passing through, expanding the rows Eli had kept for years. She planted beans and squash and potatoes and turnips and coaxed a row of carrots that he had attempted once before and given up on into actually growing. He watched her in the garden with that deep, steady, proprietary pride that she had come to think of as simply the particular quality of his love. He was always visible when she was outside, not hovering, not anxious, just present, within reach, doing his own tasks in a range that could rapidly become very small if anything looked wrong. She understood it, and she did not resent it, because it was not the smothering, controlling attention she had seen in some men, the kind that came from wanting to own and possess. It was protective in the most literal and elemental sense, the way a wolf is protective of its territory, absolute and tireless and completely genuine. They spent evenings on the front steps watching the light die behind the western peaks, and the conversations had become the kind that happen between people who know each other deeply and are not trying to say something new, but are simply enjoying the company of the other's mind. He asked her about books she had read and listened with genuine interest. She asked him about the mountains, the seasons, the animals, and he talked about those things with a quiet eloquence that still surprised her every time. He knew where the bears denned in winter and where the elk came down to the salt licks in spring. He knew which clouds meant snow and which meant just wind. He knew how cold it would need to get for the creek to freeze solid enough to walk on. One evening in late June, she asked him about his family, the brothers back in Missouri, whether he ever thought about going back. He was quiet for a long time, longer than his usual quiet, which was different. "I think about them," he said. "My youngest brother, James, he was just 17 when I left. He would be a grown man now. They are all grown." A pause. "Our father died the year I came to Montana. I got a letter from my mother in the spring." She looked at him. "I'm sorry." "He was a hard man," Eli said, not harshly, just factually. "Not a bad man, but hard. He wanted me to stay and farm the land he had. I could not do it." He looked at the mountain peaks going gold in the last light. "I think he understood at the end. My mother wrote that he said I was the most like him, that I was the one who knew what he wanted and went after it." "Your father was right about you," Clara said. He looked at her sideways. "You know what you want," she said, "and you went after it. You built everything you needed on this mountain with your own hands." "I did not build you," he said. "No," she said. "That was better luck than building." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they watched the last light leave the peaks, and she thought that there was not a single thing she would change about her life, which was the first time she had ever thought that, and known it to be completely and unreservedly true. July arrived, and with it the waiting. Dr. Hammond had been written to and had sent a brief businesslike reply confirming he would come when sent for. Clara had everything prepared. The baby clothes sewed and washed and folded, the bedroom arranged, the birthing supplies Eli had fetched from Deer Lodge on his last trading trip, a crib he had built himself from pine boards over several weeks, the craftsmanship more careful than anything else in the cabin, every corner smoothed until it was silk soft, every joint tight enough to last a generation. He had built the crib on the evenings when she read aloud. She would read Jane Eyre first and then the almanac, and then parts of the Bible, and he would work on the crib by firelight, the sound of his plane moving over the pine boards, a low, steady counterpoint to her voice. She looked up sometimes and watched him without stopping reading, the firelight moving over his face and his hands, and thought about the word home and how completely she had misunderstood it for 22 years. Home was not a building. It was not a place you were born or a place your people were from. It was a specific feeling that existed in the presence of a specific person, and you could not manufacture it or find it on a map. You could only stumble across it, the way she had stumbled across this clearing in the dark with a broken wheel behind her and a lantern in her hand. The labor started on the 14th of July, a Wednesday, in the early morning when the sky was just beginning to silver in the east. Eli sent for Dr. Hammond as soon as it was clear what was happening, riding to the nearest neighbor, a homesteader named McCready 4 miles south, and asking him to ride to Deer Lodge. Then he came back. He stayed. He had promised, and Eli did not make promises lightly. He stayed through all of it, the long hours of it, through the pain and the work and the difficulty, with his hand for her to grip when she needed to grip something, and his quiet voice telling her again and again that she was doing fine, that she was strong, that he was there. Dr. Hammond arrived in the early afternoon, a neat, brisk man who had delivered children in the Montana Territory for 10 years, and was not in the habit of being surprised, but who raised an eyebrow slightly at the mountain man who remained in the room, solid and immovable as the cabin's center beam, and who said nothing because there was something in Eli Carne's face that did not invite argument. The baby was born at 4 in the afternoon, on a warm July day, with the light coming golden through the cabin window and a meadowlark singing somewhere outside in the long grass. It was a boy. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, and Dr. Hammond put the wrapped and cleaned and very new baby into his arms, and Clara watched it from the pillow, exhausted and aching, and more completely, piercing happy than she had been in her life. Eli held the baby the way he held everything important, carefully, with complete attention, nothing casual about it. The baby was tiny against the massive broadness of his chest, one enormous hand cradling the infant's head with a gentleness that seemed almost improbable from hands that could split a log with a single stroke. He looked at the baby for a long time without speaking. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was trying to contain something too large for ordinary expression. He looked up at Clara, and she saw that his eyes were wet. She had not seen that before. She had not known his eyes could do that. "A son," he said. His voice was rough with it. "Just as you said," she told him. He looked back at the baby, and the expression on his face was the largest thing she had ever seen on a human face. It held everything: love and pride and wonder and a fierce, absolute protectiveness, and underneath all of it, something that looked very much like a man arriving at the destination he had been traveling toward his whole life without knowing it. "What do we name him?" she asked. Eli was quiet for a moment. "James," he said. "After my brother." She thought about it. "James Carne." "James Thomas Carne," Eli said, and looked at her over the baby's head. "After both of them." She pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment, because that was the thing about Eli. Just when she thought she could not love him more, he did something like that. "James Thomas Carne," she said. "Yes." Dr. Hammond departed with his fee and a jar of Clara's preserved plum jam that she insisted on giving him, and they were alone in the cabin, the three of them, as the long July day went to evening and the light softened and the meadowlark was still somewhere out in the grass. Eli put James in the crib he had built and stood looking down at him for a long moment. Then he came to the bed and sat beside Clara, and she leaned against him, and they were quiet together, while the fire burned low, and the summer dark came on soft and warm, and outside the mountain stood as it always had, and the trees moved in the night wind, and the creek ran down in the dark below the timber. And it was, Clara thought, the most perfect moment of her life. The weeks that followed were full and sweet and exhausting, the way new parenthood always is, but shaped by the particular quality of the life they had built. Eli took to fatherhood with the same complete, wholehearted competence with which he took to everything. He learned what James needed with extraordinary speed, which sounds meant hunger, and which meant discomfort, and which meant only the need to be held and moved. And he held the baby with a naturalness that Clara found endlessly touching, this massive, powerful man walking the length of the cabin in the small hours with James against his shoulder, one great hand patting the tiny back, humming something low and tuneless and inexhaustibly patient. She recovered well, and by August she was moving through her full range of tasks again, the garden producing abundantly and the root cellar beginning to fill with the summer's harvest. Eli had started on an addition to the cabin, a second room, framed out already, the walls going up log by log in the evenings after his other work was done. He said nothing about why he was building it, but she knew it was because a family needed more room than a trapper alone, and the certainty with which he said family in his head, even without saying it aloud, was something she could feel in everything he did. September brought a letter from Clara's Aunt Margaret, forwarded through the Deer Lodge postal office where Eli collected their mail on his trading trips. The aunt had received Clara's letter from the previous winter explaining her situation, and had replied with a combination of concern and pragmatic acceptance that Clara recognized as the Whitfield family manner. The aunt said she was glad Clara had found someone reliable, that she wished her health in her confinement, and that she expected to meet this mountain man before she died. Clara wrote back that when spring came, they would come to Deer Lodge with the baby, and the aunt was welcome to judge the mountain man for herself. The autumn settled into its rhythms, the elk coming down from the high country, the aspens going gold in the draws and bright orange along the creek, the mornings colder and clearer, and the wood smoke from the cabin hanging straight up in the still air. Eli's trap lines were set, and the winter provisions laid by, and the new room on the cabin closed in and roofed before the first hard frost. James was growing at the extraordinary pace that infants have for making all your previous measurements of time seem completely inaccurate. He was 2 months old and already showing a quality of watchful attention that his mother recognized and his father greeted with uncomplicated pride. He had Eli's dark eyes and Clara's coloring, and the combination produced a child of unreasonable beauty, though Clara was the first to acknowledge that this assessment was not objective. On an October evening, with the fire built high and James asleep in his crib and the first real snow of the season coming down soft and steady outside, Eli sat across the table from her and said, without preamble, "Marry me." She looked up from the baby gown she was hemming. "I should have asked before now," he said. "I did not think to ask. I did not think in those terms when you came. And then it was winter, and we were who we were to each other, and then the baby was coming. And I kept not asking because the asking seemed less important than the doing." He paused. "But it matters. You should have the asking." She set down the gown. She looked at him steadily across the firelit table. This man she had loved for a year and shared a bed with and a life with and a child with. This man who had shown her every day in every possible way that she was completely and unconditionally his, or rather, which was more accurate, that he was completely and unconditionally hers. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." Something easy and warm moved over his face. "Reverend Alcott rides a circuit through Deer Lodge," he said. "He will be through in November." "Then we will be married in November," Clara said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over under his, and their fingers wove together, and outside the snow came down, and the fire burned, and the baby slept, and the mountain stood dark against the dark sky. And she thought that she had not known, at 22 years old with a broken wheel and a lantern in the dark, that her whole life was about to begin. The wedding was on a Friday in the second week of November, in the small church in Deer Lodge that Reverend Alcott used as his base between his circuit rides. Eli wore his best clothes, which meant clean dark trousers, a good flannel shirt, and his leather vest, and he had trimmed his beard and pulled his hair back at the neck with a leather tie. and Clara thought when she saw him waiting at the front of the church that he was the finest-looking man she had ever seen in her life, which she had thought before, but it hit her fresh and surprising in the new context of the church's morning light. She wore her best dress, blue wool, and carried a small bunch of late-season dried flowers she had brought from the cabin. James was held through the ceremony by Eli's McCready neighbor, who had ridden to Deer Lodge for the occasion, his wife standing beside him and crying quietly from the moment the ceremony began. Reverend Alcott was a small, quick man who had married 100 couples in churches and on riverbanks and in wagon beds, and once famously in a tree during a flood, and who had a gift for making the ceremony feel both ancient and entirely personal. When he said to Eli, "Do you take this woman?" and Eli said, "I do," the simplicity of it was so complete and so absolutely certain that the Reverend paused for just a moment, as if the weight of it needed a moment to settle. Afterward, they ate at the Deer Lodge Hotel's dining room, Eli's suggestion, which surprised everyone including Clara, and James was passed around the table and admired by everyone present, and Eli sat at the head of the table with Clara beside him and James on his knee, and the look on his face was the same look he had worn in the barn in January, the same look he had worn when the baby was put into his arms in July, that vast, steady, luminous pride that she had decided was simply the particular quality of Eli Carne's love, enormous and unhurried and inexhaustible. They drove back to the mountain the next day, the three of them in the wagon with smoke tied behind, and the mountain welcomed them back with 2 feet of new snow and a sky so clear it ached, and the cabin was cold when they got home, but it warmed fast with a good fire, and James slept through the night for the first time, and Clara thought that this was what it was to be exactly and completely where you were supposed to be, in the exact company you were made for, and that she was luckier than she deserved. The first winter of their marriage was the happiest time of Clara's life, and she had some happy times already stored up to measure against. The new room was habitable. Eli had finished the interior walls and laid a plank floor and built a second fireplace, smaller than the main one, against the outer wall. This became James's room as soon as he was old enough to sleep there, which was not yet, but the room itself became, in the meantime, a sitting room where Clara sewed in the evenings and where Eli sometimes brought in work that needed better light than the main room's fire. James, at 4 months, was a person of definite opinions. He had his father's quality of absolute, concentrated attention when something interested him, and his mother's complete and cheerful fearlessness. He also had what Eli called his mother's stubbornness, and what Clara called his father's stubbornness, and neither of them was wrong, and the baby had simply inherited the stubbornness of both, which made it formidable. Eli carried James everywhere when he was indoors, which was more often now in the deep winter. He would carry the baby in the crook of one arm while he worked, tending the fire, cleaning equipment, sorting through the winter's accumulating pelts, and James would watch everything with enormous dark eyes and occasionally reach out and grab whatever was within reach. Once he grabbed a trap spring and Eli caught his hand so fast that Clara, watching from across the room, barely saw it happen. "He's going to be quick," Eli said, looking at the baby with satisfaction. "He's going to be a handful," Clara said. "Same thing," Eli said. She laughed. It was not the same thing at all, and it was exactly the same thing. The spring of 1875 came, and with it the visit to Deer Lodge that Clara had promised her aunt. They made the trip in April, loading the wagon with James and his necessities, and Clara's aunt gift of 2 jars of preserved berries and a smoked ham from the pig they had butchered in February. Eli drove. He always drove. Clara held James and watched the country open out of the mountain trees into the broader valley below, and the world felt very large after the close, cozy dimensions of the winter cabin. Aunt Margaret lived in a neat frame house on the edge of the Deer Lodge settlement, a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 64 who had homesteaded this country with her late husband 20 years ago, and who had buried him and stayed. She met them at her gate and looked at Clara and then at the baby, and then at Eli, who was climbing down from the wagon, and she stood there for a moment taking him in, all 6 feet 2 and 230 pounds of him, the dark eyes and the strong jaw and the breadth of shoulder and the careful, watchful quality of his stillness. And she said to Clara, who had come to stand beside her, "Well, I understand why you did not come to me." Clara laughed. "Aunt Margaret, this is my husband, Eli Carne." Eli stepped forward and put out his hand, and Aunt Margaret shook it with the directness of a woman who had never seen any reason to be less than direct, and she said, "You look like someone built you specifically for the mountains." "Yes, ma'am," Eli said. "Good," she said. "My niece has good judgment. Come inside, I have coffee on." She approved of Eli, which she communicated not through compliments, but through the quality of her attention to him, asking him practical questions about the land and the cabin and the trap lines, listening to his answers with genuine interest, and concluding that afternoon with the pronouncement, "You built the crib yourself, you say, with pine from the property, smooth enough not to snag the clothes." She nodded once. "That is a man who thinks ahead." Eli looked at her with those dark eyes. "I try. Try harder to bring them to visit more than once a year," she said, and moved to pour more coffee, and the matter was settled. They drove home in the long April evening, the valley gold and lavender in the setting sun, James asleep in Clara's arms, Eli beside her with the reins loose in his hands. She leaned against his shoulder the way she did on the cabin steps in the evenings, fitting perfectly in the particular space of his arm, and he tilted his head slightly against hers. "She likes you," Clara said. "She likes that you are not alone," he said. "She likes you," Clara repeated. He was quiet for a moment. "I like her," he said. The trail home wound up into the mountains as the stars came out, one and then a dozen, and then a whole blazing, overflowing sky full, and the horses moved steadily upward through the dark pine trees with the certainty of animals who knew the way home. And it was the kind of night that engraves itself in memory, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because everything was so completely and perfectly good that the mind holds it separately from ordinary time, preserved whole. Summer of 1875. James was pulling himself up on the furniture by August, and the cabin suddenly seemed smaller than it had been, which was actually the cabin being the same size and James having developed the ability to cover it at speed. Eli watched this development with enormous interest. He would sit in his chair by the fire in the evenings, and James would navigate the room using whatever was available: chair leg, table leg, the fireplace stone, Eli's knee, and Eli would track every movement with those dark, attentive eyes and the expression of a man watching something genuinely impressive. "He is going to be walking by September," Eli said one evening in August. "The cabin is not large enough for a walking James," Clara said, mending a shirt at the table. "The new room has more space," Eli said, "and the yard. The yard has a well." "I will build a fence," Eli said. He built a fence around the section of yard that ran from the cabin door to the garden, low and sturdy, made of pine rails, split from the same timber he used for everything. It was finished in 3 days, working mornings before the heat built up, and the gate had a latch that required both hands to open and was therefore entirely beyond the reach of a 1-year-old's capability, which was the point. James walked in September. He walked at exactly the age his father had predicted, and Eli's satisfaction at this fact was entirely disproportionate and absolutely genuine. The baby's first independent steps were across the main room toward his father, who was crouched on the far side with his hands on his knees, waiting, his face wearing that open smile that she had first earned in the 3rd week of their life together, and that she still thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. James made it 4 steps before he sat down. He looked up at his father. Eli clapped, slow and deliberate, and said, "Good." And James, reading the satisfaction in his father's voice, lit up and clapped his own hands together in imitation, and Clara was laughing so hard by this point that neither of them paid any attention to her at all, which was fine. She did not need the attention. She needed to be right here in this room, watching these 2 people who were her entire world discover each other. By the time James was 18 months old and fully mobile, in a way that kept both his parents in a constant state of alert, Clara was expecting again. She told Eli in the same direct way she had told him the first time, coming to find him in the barn on a November morning, and he put down what he was doing and turned and looked at her, and the same vast expression moved through his face, the same wonder, the same pride, not lessened by repetition, but deepened by it, the way a river deepens its channel over time. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she agreed. He crossed to her and held her face in both his hands and looked at her the way he had that January morning almost 2 years ago. That look that still made her breath stop, that look of a man seeing everything he valued most in the world in one place. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am nothing of the sort," she said, though she was smiling. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said with complete and simple conviction, and kissed her, and James, who had learned to stand behind his parents and demand participation in anything that looked like a hug, shoved himself against both their legs and said with great authority, "Up!" Eli picked him up with one arm without breaking the kiss, and James grabbed a fistful of his father's hair and yanked with cheerful determination, and Clara started laughing against Eli's mouth, and it was, she thought, absolutely perfect. The second winter was as deep as the first, and the cabin was full in the way that a cabin with a toddler is always full, not crowded exactly, but continuously, actively occupied, every corner a potential adventure, and every quiet moment a temporary condition. Eli was patient with James in a way that Clara had suspected he would be, but that still moved her every time she witnessed it. Patient the way mountains are patient, not passively but fundamentally, as though impatience was simply not among his available responses. James tested this patience comprehensively and found it, repeatedly, immovable. He read to the boy in the evenings. She had started reading to James from early infancy, but now Eli had taken it over. The boy settled into the crook of his father's arm, Eli's big hand turning the pages of Robinson Crusoe, the same battered copy that had been on the shelf when Clara arrived, his voice low and steady, and James would look at the pages with deep, serious attention, as though the lines of text were personally addressed to him. The second baby came in June of 1876, a girl this time, born easier than James and equally beautiful. They named her Margaret Clara Carne, after Aunt Margaret and her mother, and Eli held her with the same extraordinary gentleness with which he had held James. But there was something additionally tender in the way he looked at her, a particular softness, something protective and wondering, as if a girl was a different and additional kind of marvel. "Margaret," he said, turning the name over in his mouth. "She looks like you," Clara said from the bed, which was true. The dark eyes, the strong jaw already suggested in the line of the infant's face. "She looks like you," he said, which was also true, the coloring, the shape of the mouth. "She looks like both of us," Clara said, which is exactly right. James's reaction to his sister was a mixture of deep suspicion and intense proprietary interest that was, his parents agreed privately, very likely the most accurate possible preview of their entire future relationship. He would come and look at her very seriously over the edge of the crib, and then look at his father, and then back at the baby, with an expression that said quite clearly, "I am assessing this." The verdict took approximately a week, and was rendered when James put his hand over his sister's head with a careful, deliberate gesture that was a perfect miniature imitation of the way his father put his hand over things he was protecting, and looked up at Eli with an expression of clear announcement. "Mine too." Eli looked at Clara over the boy's head with something that was profoundly moved and profoundly amused at the same time. "He is going to be trouble," Clara said. "He's going to be fine," Eli said. "He has good instincts." The summer of 1876 was warm and abundant, the garden the best it had been since Clara's first full season on the mountain, the root cellar filling satisfyingly, the children growing with the heedless energy of young things in good summer. Eli made his trading trips to Deer Lodge and came back each time with the pack horse loaded and a new observation about the settlement's growth. A second general store had opened, a doctor had set up a proper practice, there was talk of a school, the territory's population was growing with the steady, inexorable pressure of westward migration. "It will change," he said one evening, not unhappily, but with the steady acknowledgement of a man who understood change. "The mountain will not change," she said. He looked at her. "No." "Will you mind? If the valley fills in?" He thought about it. "I will mind if it reaches here," he said. "It will not reach here for a long time." He was right about that. The mountain trail was too difficult for most settlers who wanted broader valley land that was easier to farm. The clearing and the timber, the cabin, the barn, the growing garden, the creek below the trees, All of this remained for many years to come, essentially their own world, visited by the occasional trapper or trader passing through, by Dr. Hammond on his annual rounds, by Reverend Alcott on his circuit, by Aunt Margaret, who came up once in September of 1876 and declared the cabin more than satisfactory, and the children credit to their mother, and who stayed 4 days and taught Clara a butter-making technique that produced a better result than anything Clara had managed before, and who was driven back to Deer Lodge by Eli in the wagon and shook his hand at her gate and said, "You are a good man, Eli Carne. Do not change." He said, "Yes, ma'am," and meant it. The years built themselves, one on the next, with the solid craftsmanship of everything Eli made. James at 4 was a boy of his father's silence and his mother's directness, and of a curiosity that was entirely his own. He wanted to know how everything worked, why everything happened, what was behind every mountain and down every trail. Eli took him on the easier parts of the trapline from the time he was 3, the boy riding in front of his father on Smoke with the self-possession of someone who has never doubted that this is exactly where he belongs. And Clara watched them go from the gate of the yard fence and felt each time the same full, aching tenderness. Margaret at 2 was everything James was and its opposite simultaneously, as physically daring as her brother but quicker to laugh, her father's eyes and her mother's laugh, a quality of delight in small things that neither parent could quite account for and both adored. She was, from very early, her father's particular weakness, in the sense that Eli Carne, who could not be moved by argument or weather or difficulty or 2 rough strangers in the clearing, could be completely undone by his daughter putting her hands on his face and looking at him with those dark eyes. Clara found this useful on several occasions. In 1877, a 3rd year after James's birth, Eli began talking about the upper meadow, a large, flat piece of ground above the timber on the eastern slope, where the grass grew long and thick in summer, and where, he said, cattle could graze between spring and fall. He had been thinking about it for 2 years, working out in his head how many head they could keep, what the winter feeding would require, how the land could be fenced, whether the water was reliable. Clara listened to all of it over many evenings, the practical reasoning of a man who was expanding his understanding of what their life could hold. She knew what this meant, and she was glad of it. He was building for more than himself now, building for a future that had a different shape than the trapper's life he had made on the mountain before she came. He was building for James and Margaret and whoever else might come, building for them to have something to inherit and work and love. He bought 8 head of cattle in the spring of 1878, driving them up the mountain trail himself with the help of McCready and McCready's oldest son, and the clearing was different after that, bigger somehow, or fuller, the sound of cattle in the upper meadow a part of the mountain sound. James was 5, and received this development with the same serious proprietorial interest with which he received everything, and appointed himself assistant manager of the cattle operation, which meant following his father everywhere on the property with intense attention and asking questions about everything. One evening that summer, Clara sat on the cabin steps in the long dusk with Margaret asleep in her arms, the warm weight of the child against her chest, and watched Eli and James walking back from the upper meadow together, the enormous man and the small boy, the boy doing 2 steps to each of the man's 1, their heads moving at different heights but tilted at the same angle, engaged in some conversation that was entirely serious from both sides. They were silhouetted against the amber sky, the mountain behind them, the grass long and golden in the evening light, and she watched them come down the slope toward her, and felt something so large and quiet move through her that it was almost like prayer. She thought about the night in September of 1874 when she had stood beside a broken wagon in the dark and made a decision to walk toward a sound. She thought about the lantern and the cold and the fire-lit clearing and the first sight of him, enormous and deliberate and complete in himself, a man who had made a world out of solitude and timber. She thought about that first night's sleep under his buffalo robes and the morning's coffee, and the 3 days she had spent in his cabin waiting for Fisher the wheelwright, and the moment she had turned the wagon around. She had known something then that she had not had words for. She had known it with the same certainty with which Eli seemed to know everything, from the belly, not from the head, with the deep animal sureness of a creature that has scented something essential. He saw her from the slope and raised his hand, a small gesture, entirely natural, the way you raise your hand to the person who is home. James saw her too and broke into a run, covering the last 100 yards at full speed, his small boots throwing up dust, and threw himself at her legs with the impact of a 5-year-old running at full commitment, carefully not disturbing the sleeping Margaret, which took a physical grace he didn't know he had. "Pa says tomorrow we can go to the north pasture," James announced, breathless. "Does he?" Clara said. "He says the grass is high enough for the heifers to move up," James said, with the gravity of a man passing on information of consequence. Eli had reached them now, stopping at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. She looked up at him. The amber light was on his face, the sky enormous and clear behind him, the mountain at his back. "High enough for the heifers," she agreed. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile, not quite, but it was what Eli gave instead of a smile when a smile was too small for what he was feeling. She shifted Margaret to one side and held out her hand, and he took it, his big hand folding completely around hers, and sat on the step below her, leaning his back against the step between her knees. And James crawled over both of them to get to the top step, and sat above them both with the supreme satisfaction of someone who has achieved his preferred position. The evening star appeared above the western peaks. Pepper and smoke moved quietly in the barn. The cattle lowed once, far up in the meadow, and were quiet. The creek ran down in the dark below the timber. "Eli," she said. "I'm going to have another child." The hand holding hers tightened slightly. He turned his head to look up at her, and there it was again. That expression, undiminished, undimmed by the years that had given him reason to expect it, still lit from within with the same first-time wonder and the same deep-rooted, expansive pride. She had never gotten used to it. She did not think she ever would. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. James, above them, said with casual authority, "I want a brother." Eli looked at him. "Is that so?" "Margaret has too many dolls," James said, as though this were a complete and logical explanation, which in his view it was. Eli looked back at Clara, and the smile came, the full, rare, completely open smile that she had spent years learning to earn and never quite stopped being astonished by. "I want a brother too," he said, in exactly the same tone James had used. She started laughing, and Margaret woke up and looked around with her enormous dark eyes, and James leaned over his father's head to peer at his sister, and Eli reached up with his free hand and steadied James by the back of his shirt, and they were all four entangled on the cabin steps in the dying amber light, and the mountain stood over them in the evening, steady and dark and eternal, and it was everything. The third child was another boy, born in the spring of 1879, and they named him Eli Samuel Carne, after his father and after Clara's father, whose middle name had been Samuel. James's reaction to this was one of complete vindication. He had told them what it would be, and he had been right, and he moved through the week of his brother's birth with the bearing of a person who has been proven correct about something important. Young Eli, little Eli, they called him for a time, to distinguish him from his father, which both Elise submitted to with varying degrees of patience, was from the very beginning a different animal than his brother and sister. Where James was contained and observant and deliberate, little Eli was a force of pure energy and noise and enthusiastic disaster, and where Margaret had her father's watchfulness and her mother's warmth, the youngest was an original, some combination of the two of them that produced something entirely new, reckless, sunny, loud, and capable of getting himself into improbable difficulties with a speed that kept his parents in a continuous state of impressed exhaustion. "He is going to be fine," Eli said for the 100th time, sitting the youngest on the fence rail while the boy attempted to climb it from the inside for the 3rd time that morning. "He's going to give me gray hair," Clara said. "You will be beautiful with gray hair," Eli said. She looked at him sharply, because this was not his usual idiom. He was looking at her with those dark eyes and the calm certainty of someone who has thought about this and knows it to be true. "You are going to be gray and beautiful and still here on this mountain," he said, "and I am going to be gray and still here beside you. And these three are going to grow up, and know what it is to have a home that is a real home." He paused. "That is what I think about." She crossed the yard to him and put her hand on his chest, over his heart, feeling the steady, powerful beating of it under his flannel shirt. He put his hand over hers. Above them, little Eli had successfully achieved the top of the fence rail and was standing on it with his arms out, balancing with the pleased unsteadiness of a very small person who has accomplished something very large. "That is what I think about too," she said. The years continued to build, as years do, carefully and quickly at the same time. James grew into a boy of 9 and then 10 and 11, long-legged and dark-eyed, and his father's son in every way that mattered. Quiet, capable, steadily competent. He learned the trap lines from his father and the kitchen garden from his mother and the cattle management from both of them. And by 12, he was riding Smoke on the shorter errands to Deer Lodge while Pepper pulled the wagon, and Eli watched him go from the yard with an expression that was composed entirely of pride and the particular kind of pain that is the price of loving someone enough to let them go. Margaret at 10 was already reading everything in the cabin, including the almanac and Robinson Crusoe and the Bibles, and had exhausted the available literature and needed more. On his spring trading trip of 1886, Eli came back from Deer Lodge with a pack-horse load that included, tucked in oilskin against the weather, 8 new books, stories and histories, and a small volume of poetry that Clara opened and sat down at the table with immediately and did not put down for 2 hours. Margaret received her books with a reverence that her father watched with quiet delight. He had chosen well, as he always did. The settlement of Deer Lodge had grown around them in those years, a proper town now, with a school that all 3 children eventually attended on the weeks when the weather made the trail passable. Clara made sure of this, the schooling, because knowledge was a thing she valued with the particular passion of someone who had been educated just enough to know how much more there was. Eli drove the children on school days when he could, and when he could not, Clara drove, and when the weather made driving impossible, they taught at home, which they were both fully capable of doing. Little Eli at 7 was reading with a fluency that startled his teacher in Deer Lodge, which his parents accepted with a modesty that was entirely false. Eli Carne, at 42, was a man who had settled more deeply into himself than seemed entirely possible, which was saying something given how settled he had been at 32. He was larger than ever, or seemed to be. The years had added a slight broadening to the already immense shoulders, a deeper weathering to the face, silver beginning in his dark hair at the temples and in his beard. He moved more slowly now, not from age but from a completeness of presence, a man who had arrived somewhere and had no need to hurry anymore. He still split his own wood and maintained his own property with a thoroughness that younger men struggled to match, and he still walked the trap lines in winter, though the trapping had become secondary to the cattle operation, which now ran 30 head and occupied a portion of each day that James increasingly shared. Clara, at 36, was everything she had been at 22 plus 10 years of wind and sun and mountain life, which had given her a few lines at the corners of her eyes and a quality of settled sureness that sat on her like a garment perfectly made for her shape. She was still striking, dark-haired now, with a single thread of silver that she was philosophical about, brown-eyed and direct and absolutely certain of her place in the world, which was here, which was this mountain, which was this man. She caught him watching her one morning in the late summer of 1886, standing in the kitchen garden in the early light, her hair loose because she had not yet put it up, reaching up to tie a bean vine to its stake. She turned and found him in the cabin doorway, leaning on the frame, coffee cup in hand, watching her with those dark eyes and the expression she had learned to read by now as fluently as a printed page, the one that meant everything, that meant her and the children and the mountain and all of it together, the one she had first seen across a firelit clearing on a September night 12 years ago. "What are you looking at?" she said, just as she had said it that evening at the fire in the early months. "Everything that is mine," he said. And then, because he was Eli, "The beans need water." She laughed and threw a bean pod at him, which he caught without looking at it, without taking his eyes off her, which made her laugh harder. James came out of the barn behind him, 15 and very nearly as tall as his father, and looked at his parents with the affectionate exasperation of a teenager who has long since accepted that his parents are going to be like this, and there is nothing to be done about it. "The north fence has a post going soft," James said. Eli turned to him. "I know. We will get to it today." "I thought so," James said, and went back inside for breakfast. And the morning came fully up over the mountain in a flood of clear September light, and Clara watched her husband and her oldest son walk to the barn together, the same height now, the same quality of movement, and thought that she was rich beyond any accounting. The fourth and last child came in 1884, a daughter they named Rose, small and red-haired in a way that neither parent could account for, but both embraced enthusiastically, her father staring at the red-gold hair on her head with an expression of complete delighted bafflement that her siblings found immensely entertaining. James at 11 was very gentle with Rose, which no one was surprised by. Margaret at 8 appointed herself Rose's primary authority on everything, which Rose at 1 already showed signs of resisting. Little Eli at 5 attempted to teach her to walk by demonstration, which was more useful than it had any right to be. Rose grew up knowing herself deeply loved. This was apparent in the way she moved through the world, not entitled exactly, but entirely unafraid, the way children are unafraid when they have never had reason to doubt that they are safe. She had her father's eyes and her mother's voice, and the particular stubbornness of the fourth child, who must be stubborn to hold any ground at all in a family with 3 older siblings. By 1890, James was 17 and beginning to talk about land, specifically the upper meadow beyond the cattle pasture, which Eli had homesteaded but not fully developed. He wanted to build there, he said. He had been thinking about it for years. He had plans in his head for a smaller cabin, a barn, a beginning. He was not asking permission. He was presenting something already decided, which was so thoroughly his father's manner that Eli heard it and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "The spring up there runs year-round. Start with the cabin first." Clara said nothing at all, and went to the garden, where she stood among the bean rows for a while in the late afternoon, and felt something enormous and quiet move through her that was not grief, but was something grief-adjacent, the feeling of time moving the way a river moves, steady and unstoppable and beautiful in the movement itself. James built his cabin in the upper meadow over 2 summers, his father working beside him every day he could. Eli never diminished this in any way, never made it less than James's own achievement, even when his hands were doing half the work. He simply showed up and worked, the way he had always done, and the cabin went up log by log in the high mountain air, and when it was finished, and James moved into it the following spring, the boy came down to the main cabin one evening and sat at the table that he had eaten at his whole life and said to his father, "How did you do it? Build the first one. Alone." Eli looked at him across the table. "You put up 1 log," he said, "and then you put up another, and one day it is a cabin." James looked at him for a moment. "That's not the whole answer." Eli almost smiled. "No," he said. "The whole answer is that you need something worth building it for." James went back up to his new cabin in the evening light, and Clara came in from the other room where she had been listening and sat across the table from Eli and looked at him. "He's going to be fine," she said. "He's always been fine," Eli said. "He was fine when he was 5 minutes old." She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat in the quiet of the cabin, the fire low, the summer evening warm through the open door, the mountain around them in the long dusk, and it was the same table and the same fire, and the same man and the same hands, and 12 years had only made everything more itself, richer and deeper and more certain than it had been even at its most certain. Margaret at 14 had begun to write, stories, not just reading them, filling the pages of a ledger book with a small, neat hand, worlds she was making out of words. Eli read the first one she showed him with the complete and focused attention he gave to everything, and when he finished, he set the book down and looked at her and said, "You got that from your mother." Clara, who had been watching from the kitchen, said, "I do not write stories." "You told stories," he said. "Every evening for 3 years you read to me and James and you made it alive. She got that from you." Clara looked at her daughter, who was looking at her father with the expression of someone who has just been given something very valuable. "You should send it somewhere," Clara told her. "There are periodicals in Deer Lodge, Eastern periodicals." Margaret did eventually, when she was 17, send something to a San Francisco journal that ran serial fiction. The letter of acceptance came to Deer Lodge in the spring, and Margaret came home from collecting the mail on horseback at a speed that brought Eli out of the barn and Clara to the door with the instinctive alarm that fast hoofbeats always produced. She came through the gate waving the letter, and Clara and Eli read it together standing in the yard, her shoulder against his arm, and Eli said when they had finished it, "That is Margaret." Just that. And his voice had in it everything it always had, the pride, the wonder, the absolute love. Rose at 6 was following her father through the cattle pasture like a small red-haired shadow, her hand in his, listening to him explain things she was much too young to understand, and nodding with the gravity of someone who understands them perfectly. Eli told her everything, the cattle, the grass, the trail signs, the weather reading off the peaks. Little Eli, at 11, had largely transferred his allegiance from his father's cattle operation to his mother's garden and to books, which was fine, which was entirely fine, and which Eli accepted with the complete flexibility of a man who understood that his children were themselves, and not him. In 1892, on a September evening 18 years exactly from the night Clara had walked through the dark with a lantern toward the sound of an axe, she stood on the cabin steps in the late light and looked at the clearing that had become, over those 18 years, a full and working and beautiful small world. The cabin was larger now, the new room and another addition on the far end that Eli had built in 1883 when Rose's arrival made space necessary. The barn was solid and full. The yard fence was weathered and mended a dozen times. The garden was the best it had ever been, the rows straight and productive, the root cellar below it packed and organized. Up in the upper meadow, smoke came from James's cabin chimney, domestic and reassuring. The cattle moved in the high pasture, dark shapes against the golden grass. Eli came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, and stopped beside her on the steps. He looked at the clearing the same way she was looking at it, the way they both looked at it sometimes, not with possessiveness but with something quieter and more profound than possession, the feeling of a life inhabited so completely that you and it had become the same thing. 18 years ago tonight, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Give or take a day. Give or take a day, she agreed. You were splitting wood in the dark. It needed splitting, he said. Eli, she said, turning to look at him, at the silver in his temples and the beard, at the lines in his weathered face, at the dark eyes that had not changed one detail since the first night, still those particular eyes, still that particular watchful, comprehensive, completely present gaze. Clara, he said. Thank you, she said, for the bed and the food and riding to Deer Lodge. She was repeating the words she had said that first morning, and he knew it. She saw him recognize it, saw the thing move through his face that was his version of being undone. Thank you, he said, for turning the wagon around. She put her hand against his chest, over his heart, the way she had done 1,000 times. He put his over hers. The evening star was coming out above the western peaks. James's chimney smoke rose straight up in the still air. Rose was somewhere in the barn singing to herself in the high, sweet voice she had been singing with since she could make sound. Little Eli was inside at the table with his books, and they could hear the occasional page turning through the open door. Margaret's letter said she will be home for Christmas, Clara said. Good, Eli said. She's bringing someone, Clara said, a young man from San Francisco. Is she? He said, and the tone was everything, resigned, proud, the particular rueful acceptance of a father who has always known this day would come. She says he is a good man, Clara said. He had better be, Eli said. She laughed and leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her, and the mountain evening settled over the clearing in all its old, eternal beauty, the light dying in the western peaks, the aspens along the creek going gold in the autumn, the air smelling of pine and wood smoke, and the particular clean cold that only lives at altitude. The cattle lowed in the upper meadow, the horses moved in the barn. Rose's singing floated out through the barn wall, sweet and unself-conscious. James came down from the upper meadow in the dusk, tall and dark on Smoke. He had taken Smoke when Eli got a younger horse, and he raised his hand when he saw them on the steps, and they raised their hands back, and he turned the horse toward the barn, and was already talking to Rose before he dismounted, his voice mixing with hers in the early dark. Clara looked up at Eli, and he looked down at her, and the eyes that had first looked at her across a firelit clearing in the September dark of 1874 were exactly what they had always been, those same dark, careful, completely present eyes, looking at her the way they had always looked at her, with the undiminished attention of a man for whom she was the most interesting and the most important thing in every room, on every mountain, in every version of the world he could imagine. "Eli," she said softly. He said, still looking at her. "I'm still glad I turned the wagon around." He pulled her closer against his side, his arm massive and warm around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I know," he said. "So am I." And above them, the last light left the mountain peaks, and the stars came out in their brilliant, overflowing multitude, and the fire was burning in the cabin behind them, and the children were coming in from the barn, and the clearing was full of the sounds of a real and living and deeply happy life. And the mountain stood above it all in the dark, patient and permanent and unchanged, having kept its people safe through 18 years of weather and season and time, as it would keep them for all the years to come, for all the years they would need.